Hi, Mystery Recapped here. Today, I'm going to explain a horror sci-fi movie called Await Further Instructions. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The movie opens with a couple, Nick and Angie, who have traveled to London to meet Nick's family and celebrate Christmas with them. Nick doesn't seem to be too excited to meet his family, so Angie tries to cheer him up. When they arrive, the couple is greeted by Nick's mom, Beth, who seems very excited to see her son and his girlfriend. Nick then introduces Angie to his grandpa, whom she politely greets, but the grandpa doesn't even respond. Moments later, Nick's father Tony arrives downstairs, but instead of warmly talking to his son, the first thing he asks is why he didn't visit for 3 years. Angie tries to calm things down and introduces herself to Tony, but he also seems very cold toward her. Shortly after, Nick's sister Kate and her husband Scott also show up and excitedly greet everyone. Kate is heavily pregnant and claims that she is worried because most of the hospitals these days are infiltrated with foreign doctors. This instantly upsets Angie, who is a doctor and of Indian descent, so Kate quickly apologizes, saying she didn't mean to offend her, even though that was obviously specifically pointed and offensive. Later, the family members begin watching TV together, during which news about a recent terrorist attack is shown. Upon seeing this, the grandpa begins talking about how it's all because of immigrants in the country, which deeply offends Angie. She tells him that he is wrong, but even Kate sides with her grandpa, which leads to a huge argument between her and Nick. In the end, Nick decides he's had enough, so he storms off upstairs with his girlfriend. Beth then apologizes for what happened and begs him not to leave, but Nick assures her that it's not her fault and hugs her. Afterward, Nick tells Angie that it's getting late, so he suggests waking up early in the morning and leaving without talking to anyone. Elsewhere, we see the grandpa fall asleep in front of the television, which soon starts to malfunction. The next morning, Nick and Angie are about to leave, but when they try to open the door, they notice it's covered with some strange black substance. They check other doors and even all the windows, but it turns out all of them are sealed by something. Nick then grabs an axe and tries to break it, but it doesn't even leave a scratch, and soon the rest of the family also shows up, wondering what's happening. They check the whole house and realize that everything is barricaded and there's no way to get outside. Tony theorizes that there may have been a disaster outside and that the government has quarantined them for their own safety. They turn on the television and on every channel a message appears, instructing the family to stay indoors and wait for further instructions. Tony speculates that it's likely an emergency broadcast, and when they check their cell phones and laptops, they realize they have no internet or signal. However, Tony remains calm and says the government will rescue them and suggests celebrating Christmas like any other day. Later, he speaks privately with Scott and asks him to stand by if things go wrong, and as men, they must sometimes make difficult decisions. We might have to eat, Grandpa. Later, the family gathers for a meal at the table when Angie begins coughing, and Kate immediately accuses her of being infected. Nick shuts his sister down, but the grandpa once again starts making racist remarks, sparking another argument between them. However, Tony silences everyone and begins to cut the turkey, just as another message appears on the screen, warning them not to eat the food as it's contaminated. Upon seeing this, Tony orders everyone to stop eating and proceeds to throw away all the food, but Nick tries to stop him, which leads to an argument between them. Meanwhile, Kate calls her husband useless while her father is taking charge, so Scott decides to step up. He interrupts the argument between Nick and Tony and then aggressively hits Nick for not listening to his dad. Moments later, the text on the TV changes, instructing them that everything is contaminated, so they must bathe themselves with bleach. Everyone follows the order and goes to the bathrooms, where they clean themselves with cleaning solutions. Sometime later, the family once again gathers in the living room when several syringes fall down the chimney. The elves are having a weird year, along with a message on the TV instructing them to use the vaccination kits due to contamination. Angie warns that this is a bad idea, pointing out that they don't know what substance they contain, and it turns out that the syringes have already been used. However, the family refuses to listen to her warnings and begins injecting themselves one by one, even the heavily pregnant Kate. Afterward, Tony forces Nick and Angie to inject themselves as well, and with no other option, they reluctantly comply. But moments later, things take a dark turn when all of a sudden the grandpa begins vomiting a black substance, after which he collapses dead on the floor, leaving everyone in shock. Angie immediately blames Tony for causing this by forcing them to inject themselves, but Tony says maybe this vaccine didn't work on his father because of his old age. Kate also agrees, suggesting that the vaccine may have caused an allergic reaction in Grandpa, as the rest of them are fine. Not long after, the TV shows another message saying they have to return the syringes through a slot in the door. Scott proceeds to push the syringes through the slot, which is between black cables, but he soon becomes curious. He then puts his hand in the slot while asking for help, and in a shocking twist, the cable ends up cutting off his finger, prompting him to scream in terror. Elsewhere, we see Nick and Tony wrapping the grandpa's dead body in sheets, and here we learn why Tony is so harsh. It turns out that when he was little, his father used to beat him for simple things, like wanting to go to the bathroom, claiming that a real man can hold it. This makes Tony emotional, but he doesn't dwell on it long and soon returns to the living room. There, the TV displays another message, saying that one of them is infected and must be isolated. Kate obviously immediately accuses Angie, since she had coughed earlier, and the rest of the family also sides with her. Upon hearing this, Nick becomes angry and begins arguing with his family, but they all proceed to gang up on him. So, to calm down the situation, Angie agrees to lock herself in another room, which turns out to be the same room where the grandpa's corpse is. Nick and Angie then talk through the door, during which she tells Nick that he should try disconnecting the television to see what happens. With this, Nick heads downstairs, where he turns off the TV just as his sister notices him and immediately calls their father. Tony turns the TV back on, which now shows a series of symbols until a warning message appears, stating that interrupting the signal could put their lives at risk. This makes Kate furious, so she orders Scott to beat her brother up. Nick tries to run upstairs, but Scott catches him, and the two begin fighting on the stairs. During the chaos, Kate, who is directly behind them, gets accidentally hit, causing her to fall from the stairs and break her leg. Upon seeing this, everyone rushes to help her while Scott freezes in shock, and when he stares at the TV, it briefly shows a message, "I see you." Nick and Beth begin to panic because Kate's bone has popped out of her leg and she's bleeding heavily. The only doctor in the house is Angie, but Tony shockingly refuses to let her out, claiming she's infected. Tony then shows no concern and says he's going to his study room, asking them not to disturb him. After he leaves, poor Beth begins crying for her daughter and pleads with the people on TV for help, but she gets no answer. A distraught Scott then tells Nick that they had already chosen names for their baby: Young Racist if it was a boy, or the Shit Princess if it was a girl. Later, Nick speaks to Angie through the door and tells her what is happening to Kate. Angie explains that Kate won't survive much longer if she doesn't get medical attention soon. Nick has had enough, so he tries to find an exit in the house, but to no avail. He eventually arrives at a bathroom where he starts breaking through a pipe to find a way out. He manages to make a hole and passes his cell phone on a stick with the camera on to record what is on the other side. Upon reviewing the footage, Nick sees a creature with tentacles throwing itself against the phone. While inside the living room, the TV emits an alert saying that the perimeter is being breached. Upon hearing the alert, Tony takes Scott and goes to find Nick, whom they locate in the bathroom. Nick tries to show his dad the video, but Tony ignores him and begins beating him severely. Tony then ties Nick to a chair just as another message appears on the TV, instructing them to extract information from the sleeper agent. Tony thinks his own son is the sleeper agent, so he begins to torture him to extract information. Even Scott is horrified and tries to stop him, but Tony refuses to listen, grabs a scalpel, and proceeds to cut his son. Next, Tony prepares to take out his son's eye, but at the last moment they are interrupted by Beth screaming. They all rush to check, and Beth shockingly reveals that Kate has passed away. Despite such grim news, Tony doesn't show much reaction, so Beth slaps him hard across the face and tells him he's always been an arrogant jerk and that she hates him. Elsewhere, Angie finds a TV in the room, and when she turns it on, she sees symbols similar to those on the TV earlier. Angie then opens the television and finds something that shakes her to her core. Soon, another message appears on the TV, stating that quarantine is activated in room 1, after which black smoke begins pouring out of the cables. It also instructs all survivors to return to the first floor. Nick quickly rushes upstairs to save his girlfriend, but the door is locked. Scott then hands him the key, and Nick manages to get his girlfriend out of the room. In another room, his mother is trapped as the smoke is thick around her and burning her. Nick desperately tries to help her, but it's too late. Beth urges them to leave and protect themselves before the room explodes, and she dies. Next, the remaining survivors gather in the living room, where the black smoke begins to retreat. A frustrated Nick unplugs the TV, but it stays on, displaying several messages that say, "I am reborn, and I bring salvation." Tony, who is an extremist believer, interprets the television as Jesus Christ and begins to rejoice and asks the TV to give him a sign. "Please, Jesus, with your many tentacles, show me the way." At that moment, Kate's belly begins to move, and Anji realizes that the baby is still alive and that she can perform a C-section to save it. She then tells Nick how she found a TV in her room, but when she opened it, she discovered a heart inside, as if it were a living being. Just then, the TV commands that they must make a sacrifice for the newborn, and even mentions the names Ruby and Lewis, which makes Scott emotional. After worshipping at the TV, Tony and Scott grab Nick for the sacrifice. While Anji desperately tries to stop them, she tells Nick that she will save the baby if he lets go of Nick, and Scott finally relents. Next, Anji proceeds to do the C-section, while Nick and Tony continue fighting, which worries her. She begs Scott to stop Tony if he wants to protect his baby, so Scott rushes to intervene, but Tony stabs him to death with an axe. Tony then begins to strangle his own son, so Anji attacks him with a bottle, leaving him collapsed on the floor. Since he is still alive, Nick drops the TV on Tony's head and finally kills him. However, the threat is far from over, as moments later the collapsed TV rises on its own and a mass of cables begins emerging from its interior. All the windows explode and the same cables appear throughout the house, which gets inside Tony's neck and comes out of his mouth. Tony's body, now controlled by the creature, approaches Nick and demands that he worship it or face extinction. Nick realizes that the creature cannot kill them because they are the only survivors and it needs someone to worship it. He then destroys the heart-like core of the creature inside the TV that triggers a massive explosion, but it ends up changing nothing. Next, we see that the creature is still alive and it uses its cables to ensnare Nick and Anji and brutally kill them. Tony's body, which is still being controlled, lifts the TV and places it next to Kate's body. The cables consume Kate's body, leaving only her skeletal remains and her newborn baby, who is surprisingly alive. The TV then displays another message that says, "Hello, shit princess. Worship me." However, the newborn obviously has no understanding of what's happening. As the movie ends, the camera pulls back to show an extensive shot of the entire neighborhood, revealing that all the houses have been attacked by the same creatures. I'd have been more surprised if that wasn't the case.